Step into the realm of the unknown with us, here at Paranormal M. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our latest mysterious tales. We hope you have a spine-chillingly good time listening. The Haunting of Rosewood Mansion. Rosewood Mansion has always been a sight to behold. The sprawling Victorian mansion nestled in the hills of Virginia was surrounded by acres of lush gardens, towering oak trees, and a serene lake. It's always been a family home for generations, passed down from one wealthy family to another. But despite its grandeur and beauty, Rosewood Mansion had a dark and twisted history. The original owner, a wealthy plantation owner named Nathaniel Rosewood, had built the mansion in the mid-1800s. He was known for his cruelty to his slaves, and it was rumored that he built secret tunnels beneath the mansion, where he would keep his slaves imprisoned. As the years passed, the mansion changed hands, but the rumors of its dark past never faded. Strange things began to happen within its walls, and soon it became known as one of the most haunted houses in the region. In 1998, the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman named Jonathan Taylor. He was enchanted by the mansion's beauty and history, planned to turn it into a luxurious hotel. But as renovations began, the workers began to experience strange occurrences. One worker reported hearing the sounds of chains clanking in the basement, while another reported seeing a ghostly figure standing in the corner of one of the rooms. Despite this, Jonathan Taylor remained determined to turn the mansion into a success. In 1999, the mansion opened its doors to the public. The grand ballroom was adorned with crystal chandeliers and the walls were covered in ornate wallpaper. Guests from all over the world flocked to the Rosewood Mansion to experience its grandeur and luxury. But it wasn't long before the guests began to experience strange happenings. Some reported hearing sounds of footsteps in the hallways, even when no one was there. Others reported seeing the ghostly figure of a woman in a flowing white dress gliding down the grand staircase. As word of the haunting spread, fewer and fewer guests were willing to stay at the Rosewood Mansion. The staff, too, began to feel uneasy. Many of them reported feeling as though they were being watched, and some reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms. Despite these occurrences, Jonathan Taylor refused to acknowledge the possibility of the mansion being haunted. He believed that the stories were simply rumors, spread by those who were jealous of his success. Overnight, as Jonathan was closing up the mansion, he heard a strange noise coming from the grand ballroom. It sounded like someone was playing the piano, but when he entered the room, he found it empty. He shrugged it off, convinced that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But as he turned to leave the room, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He turned around to see the ghostly figure of a woman in a white dress standing before him. Her eyes were dark, empty. Her skin was translucent. Jonathan tried to run, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the ground. He felt a cold grip on his shoulder. He heard a voice whisper into his ear. "Leave this place," the voice said, "or suffer the consequences." Terrified, John fled the mansion and never returned. The next day, he put the mansion up for sale and sold it at a loss. The new owners, a family of 4, moved into it in 2001. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, and they would hear strange noises coming from within the walls. One night, the younger daughter woke up to see a ghostly figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was the same woman in the white dress that Jonathan had encountered. The family tried to ignore the strange happenings, but they became more and more frequent. They finally reached their breaking point when they found words saying, "Get out," written in blood on the walls of the master bedroom. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. As a young girl growing up in West Virginia, Abby had heard stories about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was a place where they sent crazy people, the ones who were far beyond help. The stories were always told with a mix of horror and excitement, and Abby had always been intrigued by the idea of exploring the old asylum. When she grew up and moved away to college, she never forgot about the old building. Years later, Abby found herself living in the same state where the asylum was located. She knew she had to see it for herself. So one weekend, she gathered some friends and made the journey to the old building. The place had been turned into a museum, and they were able to take a guided tour of the whole building. As they walked through the halls, Abby couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was almost as if she could see and sense the ghosts, and that they were still lingering in the air. After the tour, Abby and her friends decided to sign up for a ghost hunting event. They were given a small group of people and sent to explore one of the more notorious areas of the asylum. Abby had never been more excited. They started their investigation in a room where a murder had taken place. They turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, Abby felt a cold breeze brush across her face. She shivered and pulled her coat tight around her. Suddenly, one of her friends let out a loud scream. Abby could hear her friends scrambling around in the dark, trying to find each other. When the lights were turned back on, Abby's friend was pale and shaking. She claimed that something had grabbed her arm and wouldn't let go. The rest of the group didn't see anything, but Abby believed her friend. She had felt the cold breeze after all. As the night went on, Abby and her friends explored other parts of the asylum. They heard strange noises and felt cold spots. Abby even claimed to see a ghostly figure walking down the hall. Eventually, the night came to an end, and they were sent back out into the real world. Abby couldn't stop thinking about the experiences that she had that night. She went back to the asylum several more times, always hoping to catch another glimpse of the paranormal. Years later, Abby found herself working as a tour guide at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. She regaled visitors with stories of the building's dark past, always trying to give them a taste of the fear and excitement that she had felt all those years ago. But as time went on, Abby started to feel a sense of the burnout. She had seen so much, experienced so many things, but that was all starting to take a toll on her. She knew it was time to step up and away from the asylum and let someone else take over. Abby retired from her position as a guide and a ghost hunter event manager in 2021, but even though she's no longer working at the asylum, she still can't shake the feeling that the paranormal things that she experienced were very real. She knows that there are certain phenomena that can't be explained by science or rational thought, and even though it scares her, she still feels drawn to the old building and the ghosts that still haunt it. The Old Asylum's Secret. The town had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum, which sat on a high hill overlooking the town. They had heard rumors of strange happenings, ghost sightings, and unexplained events taking place inside its walls. Some said that the building was cursed and that anyone who entered would never leave. Despite the rumors, people continued to explore the building, hoping to uncover its secrets. One such person was a young woman named Lily. She had been interested in the building since she was a child and had always dreamed of exploring its halls. One day, Lily managed to get permission to visit the building. She was thrilled at the opportunity to set off early in the morning to explore. The building was even more eerie than she had imagined. She felt a chill run down her spine as she entered. The building was dark and musty, and Lily could feel the weight of its history all around her. She wandered through the halls, searching for anything that might give her a clue about the building's past. As she moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder, began to hear strange noises. She turned a corner and saw a shadow figure moving along the wall. She froze in terror, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the shadow took on a more distinct shape. She realized that it was a person. The figure beckoned to her, and she felt an overwhelming urge to follow. She trailed the figure through the winding corridors of the building, feeling more and more lost as she went. Finally, they came to a door at the end of the long hallway. The figure pointed to the door, and Lily slowly pushed it open. Inside, she found a room that looked as though it had been frozen in time. There were old books, papers, and instruments scattered all around the room. In the center of the room was an old desk, and on it sat an old diary. Lily felt drawn to the diary and began to read. As she read, She realized that the diary belonged to a patient who had been admitted to the asylum in the late 1800s. The patient had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been subjected to cruel treatments and experiments. Lily felt her heart break as she read about the patient's suffering. She wondered how many other patients had been treated the same way and how much they had never left. As she closed the diary, she heard a voice behind her. She turned around to see the figure that had led her into the room. The figure spoke to her, telling her that there was more to the building than she could ever imagine. Lily left the asylum that day feeling haunted by what she had seen and what she read. She knew that the secrets of the building would stay with her forever, and she wondered how many others had been drawn into the building by its mysterious past. The Haunted Apartment, a Tale of Ghostly Encounters. In the summer of 1997, I moved into a small apartment in a downtown area of a large city. It was an old building with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was cheap and close to my job. At first, everything seemed fine. I unpacked my boxes and settled in, enjoying my newfound independence. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. And it started with little things like doors opening and closing by themselves, and objects moving when I wasn't looking. I brushed it off like my imagination or the wind, but as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, I was getting ready for bed and I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. They were slow but deliberate steps. They seemed to be coming closer and closer, and I froze, convinced that someone had broken into my apartment. But when I flung the door open, there was no one there. Over the next few days, I started seeing strange shadows moving across the walls. They were human-like, but distorted and elongated, like something out of a horror movie. I tried to ignore them, but they were always there, lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. One night as I was laying in bed, I felt something sit down on the edge of my mattress. I was too scared to turn over and see what it was, but I could feel the weight of pressing down on my mattress. I lay there frozen in terror until the weight lifted and the presence was gone. By this point, I was convinced that my apartment was haunted. I started doing research into the building's history, and I did discover that it had been built in the early 1900s as a hotel for travelers passing through the city. Over the years, it had been converted into apartments, but rumors persisted that the hotel's original owner had died in one of the rooms. I knew I had to do something to get rid of the ghostly presence in my apartment. I consulted with a spiritual advisor who recommended a series of rituals involving sage, salt, and prayers. I did everything she told me to do, and for a few days it seemed like the apartment was back to normal. But then things took a turn for the worse. I started hearing whispers in my ear, and I felt cold spots in various parts of the apartment. Doors would slam shut by themselves, and the shadows on the walls became more menacing. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. Finally, one night, I woke up to find the ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, thin man with a giant face and sunken eyes. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his anger and his despair radiating off of him. I knew then that I had to get out of this apartment no matter what the cost. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I never went back to the apartment, but I did hear from a friend that the building had been condemned a few months later. The owners claimed that it was due to structural problems, but I knew better. The ghost of the haunted owner was still there, haunting the halls and scaring away anybody who dared to stay too long. In 2010, I moved into an old house in the countryside with my husband and 2 children. It was a beautiful home, but something about it always made me feel uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I always felt like we were being watched. One night a few months after we settled in, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was my husband getting up to use the bathroom, but then I realized that the footsteps were too heavy to be his. I nudged my husband awake, and we both listened as the footsteps slowly made their way down the hallway and into our bedroom. We were both paralyzed with fear, and I remember holding my breath as the footsteps stopped at the foot of our bed. I could feel something watching us, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. Eventually, the feeling passed, and we fell back asleep. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the house. We would hear doors opening and closing on their own, and sometimes we would find things moved from their original positions. It was unsettling, but we didn't think too much of it at first. Then one night, we were awoke by a loud crashing sound coming from the living room. We both jumped out of bed and ran to investigate, but when we got there was no one there. However, we did notice that a vase had been knocked over and shattered onto the ground. It was at this point that we decided to try and communicate with whatever was in our house. We sat down at the kitchen table and placed a candle in the center, hoping to attract the attention of any spirits that might be present. We asked questions and waited for responses, but nothing seemed to happen. However, the next morning we found the candle had been burned down to the base, and the wax had formed strange shapes and symbols that we couldn't quite decipher. We didn't know what it meant, but we both felt like it was a sign that something was with us. As time went on, we started to experience more and more of the paranormal activity in the house. We would see shadowy figures out of the corners of our eyes, and sometimes we would hear voices speaking when no one was around. Eventually, we decided that we couldn't take it anymore, and we sold the house to a young couple who were looking for a fixer-upper. We never told them about their experiences, but we couldn't help feeling guilty about passing on the haunted house to someone else. A few months later, I heard that the couple had abandoned the house, claiming that it was cursed that the strange things kept happening to them. We never found out what happened. We both knew that the house was haunted, and that we had made the right decision to leave it behind, and to this day, I still feel like something is watching me, and I know that I'll never forget our experiences in that haunted house. Lila was at a point in her life where she felt like everything was going wrong. She lost her job, her long-term boyfriend had broken up with her, and she had been in a car accident that left her with a broken leg. She felt lost and didn't know which way to turn. One day while browsing through a thrift store, she came across an old Ouija board. She'd always been curious about them and decided to buy it. When she got home, she set up the board and started to play with it. At first, nothing happened, but after a few minutes, the planchette started to move up on its own. Lila was thrilled and asked the spirit questions about the future. The spirit told her that things would get better, but she needed to be patient and work hard. Lila became obsessed with the board and started using it every single day. She would spend hours talking to the spirits and asking for guidance. She felt like she had finally found a way to navigate through her rough times. But as time went on, Lila started to notice that things were getting worse instead of better. She was having nightmares, her relationship with friends and family were deteriorating, and she felt like something was watching her all the time. She started to wonder if the board was the cause of all of her problems. Lila tried to stop using the board, but she found that she couldn't. It was like an addiction, and she couldn't resist the urge to use it. She started to research online about how to safely use the board and found conflicting information. Some sources said it was just a game, while others warned against the dangers. She decided to reach out to a psychic who specialized in spirit communication. The psychic warned her that the Ouija boards could be dangerous and that she should be careful. The psychic advised how to cleanse her home with sage and ask for protection from her spirit guides before using the board. Lila took the advice and started to use the board more cautiously. She asked for protection from her spirit guides before each session and made sure to cleanse her home regularly. She noticed that things started to get better and she felt more in control of her life. But she also realized that the board wasn't the answer to her problems. She needed to take responsibility for her life and make positive changes. She started to focus on her passions and hobbies, and she even started her own business. Lila still has the Ouija board, but she only uses it on rare occasions. She learned that seeking guidance from spirits can be helpful, but it's not a substitute for taking action and making positive changes in your life. The Return of Max. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and the paranormal were nothing more than fictional stories in my mind. That was until Max returned to me. Max was my dog, a golden retriever. He was my best friend for years. We had a bond that no one could understand. We'd always go around the house and he'd be wagging his tail and barking joyfully. He was my constant companion and confidant. One day Max died. He had been sick for a long time, and it was a relief to see him finally at peace. I mourned his death for weeks, missing his constant presence in my life. But then one night, Max returned to me. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise at the door. It was a Max bark. I could recognize it anywhere. I thought it was just my imagination, but the barking continued. I got up, opened the door, and there he was, wagging his tail and barking with joy. I was stunned. Max had died weeks ago, so how was he standing in front of me now? It was like he had never left. He followed me around the house just like always. And I knew it wasn't a dream. Max was really there. Over the next few days, Max continued to visit me. He would bark at the door, and I would visit and let him in. And we would just spend hours playing and cuddling. It was like he had never died. I tried to explain it away as a hallucination or a dream, but it was too real. And one night, Max led me outside. He took me to a spot in the yard and started digging. I watched in amazement as he dug up a bone, his favorite toy. It was buried there years ago when we were playing in the yard together. It was like he wanted to show me that he was really there, that it wasn't a figment of my imagination. But then, just suddenly as he appeared, Max was gone. I never saw him again. I searched for him, calling out his name, but he never came back. It was like he had fulfilled his purpose to show me that he was still with me in spirit. I still don't know how to explain it. Was it a dream, a hallucination, or was Max really there with me? All I know is that it gave me comfort to think that it's still watching over me, even in death. It was a quiet evening and Emma was in her parents' room with their dogs. The dogs were playfully barking and Emma was enjoying their company. Suddenly all three dogs stopped in their tracks and started intently staring at the doorway. Emma could feel her heart racing as the dogs refused to draw their attention away from the door. She could sense that something wasn't right. Emma tried to brush off the feeling of continuing to play with the dogs, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She remembered that her mom had told her that her grandparents' old room used to be haunted by a ghost. Emma had never believed in ghosts before, but she couldn't ignore the fact that her dogs were sensing something that she couldn't see. As the night went on, Emma began to hear strange noises in the room. The dogs were whimpering and growling, and Emma could hear footsteps coming from the hallway. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't ignore the fear that was creeping up inside of her. Suddenly the room went dark and Emma's dogs began to growl. She could feel a cold breeze brush past her, and she knew that she wasn't alone. Emma reached for her phone, but the battery was dead. She was trapped in the darkness with whatever was in the room with her. After what felt like hours, the darkness began to lift, and Emma could see a figure standing in front of her. It was her great-grandfather who had passed away many years ago. He was staring at her with a look of sorrow and regret. Emma could feel his sadness, and she knew that he was trying to tell her something. As quickly as he had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to normal. Emma was left in shock, unsure of what had just happened. She knew that her dogs had sensed something, and she had felt it too. Emma couldn't explain what had just occurred, but she knew that she would never forget the feeling of being watched by her great-grandfather's ghost. It was a humid summer night and Sarah was wide awake, unable to sleep. She decided to get out of bed and go to the kitchen and grab a glass of water. As she walked down the hallway towards the kitchen, she noticed a cold breeze. She shrugged it off, thinking it was just air conditioning. As she reached the kitchen, she saw a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but nothing was there. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just maybe her seeing things. She went to grab a glass and fill it with water, and when she heard a whisper in her ear, she quickly turned around, but no one was there. Sarah began to feel uneasy. but she decided to ignore it and go back to bed. As she climbed in, she noticed her dog, Jack, was staring intently at the door. Jack was a rescue dog, and Sarah always thought that he had an unusual sensitivity to things. She shrugged it off and fell asleep. The next morning, Sarah woke up and headed to the kitchen to make breakfast. As she was cooking, she noticed a photo on the counter. It was a photo of her grandfather who had passed away a few years earlier. She picked it up and smiled, thinking of all the happy memories they shared. Suddenly, she heard the same whisper from the night before. It was soft, sort of gentle, but she couldn't make out what it was saying. She turned around, but no one was there, and her heart began to race. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. As the days went by, Sarah started to notice strange things happening in her house. Objects would move, doors would creak open, and she would hear strange noises at night. She even started to see shadowy figures more often, but they were always fleeting, disappearing as soon as she looked directly at them. One day, Sarah decided to call her best friend Lily, who was a psychic medium. She told her everything about what had been happening in her house and asked her for advice. Lily listened carefully and told her that her house was being haunted by a ghost. Sarah was skeptical at first, but Lily explained that the ghost was probably her grandfather. She said that it was common for a deceased loved one to visit their family members, especially if they were attached to a particular place or object. Lily suggested that Sarah try to communicate with the ghost, to find out what it wanted or why it was there. Sarah was nervous but decided to give it a try. She sat in her living room and tried to talk with the ghost. At first, nothing happened, but after a few minutes, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. It was her grandfather's voice, and he told her that he was happy to see her again and that he loved her. Sarah was overwhelmed with emotion and tears started to stream down her face. She thanked her grandfather for visiting her and promised to always remember him. After that day, Sarah felt a sense of peace in her house. The strange occurrences stopped, and she no longer felt scared or uneasy. She knew that her grandfather was watching over her, and she felt grateful that she had the opportunity to communicate with him. In the end, Sarah realized that sometimes, even in death, our loved ones never truly leave us. They may visit us in ways we can't explain or understand, but their presence is always felt, and sometimes all we need to do is open our hearts and minds to the unknown, to connect with them once again. The incident with the door handle turning on its own had shaken me to the core. I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister lurking in the shadows of my apartment building. I tried to brush it off as a freak occurrence, but deep down I knew there was something not quite right about the building. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen with increasing frequency. I would hear footsteps outside my door late at night, but when I checked, there was never anything there. Objects would move inexplicably, and sometimes I would catch a glimpse of some strange shapes or shadows out of the corner of my eye. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but the unease that had settled in my chest wouldn't go away. It was as though something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down so that it could pounce. One night I decided to do some investigating. I waited until midnight, when I knew that most people would be asleep, and then I crept out of my apartment and into the stairwell. It was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my own breathing and the soft click of my footsteps against the concrete. I made my way up to the 4th floor, where I knew there was a storage room that was rarely used. As I approached the door, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I was taking a risk, but I had to know what was going on here. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. It was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't see anything. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something move in the corner of the room. I froze, unsure of what to do next. It was as though something was watching me, sizing me up, trying to decide whether or not I was a threat. My mind raced with possibilities, and I wondered if I had made a mistake by coming here alone. Then suddenly there was a flash of movement, and I felt something brush past me. I suddenly stumbled backwards, tripping over a pile of boxes, and I fell to the ground. When I looked up, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs that seemed to stretch on forever. Its face was twisted into a grotesque mask with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. I screamed, scrambling backwards as fast as I could. The figure advanced towards me. Its long limbs reached out to grab me. I knew that I had to get away, or else I'd be trapped forever in this particular nightmare. I scrambled in my feet and ran toward the door, praying that it would open. To my relief, it did, and as I burst through into the stairwell, grasping my breath, I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, and even then, I locked the door behind me, huddled in the corner, trembling in fear. I knew that I'd seen something that night, something that was not of this world, and I didn't know what to do. The next day, I called in sick to work, and I spent a day researching paranormal activity in the area. I found a website that listed all the reported hauntings in the city, and as I scrolled through the list, I felt a chill run down my spine. There on the list was my apartment. It was said to be haunted by a ghost of a man who died in a freak accident on the 4th floor. His spirit was said to roam the building searching for something that he had lost in life. As I read through the accounts of other residents who had experienced strange phenomena, I felt a sense of validation. Finally, I had proof that I wasn't just imagining things. There was something truly eerie about this building, and I wasn't the only one who noticed it. But at the time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. If the building was truly haunted, what was I supposed to do? I couldn't just move out. I had signed a lease for a year, and breaking it would mean paying a hefty fee. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began researching ways to cleanse the haunted space, and came across a number of different methods. Burning sage, sprinkling salt, reciting prayers, and more. I wasn't sure which method was the best, but I knew that I had to try something. So that night, armed with a bundle of sage and a bottle of holy water I'd borrowed from a friend, I set out to cleanse my apartment. I started with the living room, moving clockwise around the room and wafting the smoke from the sage around the edges of the walls. I recited a prayer under my breath, asking for protection and guidance. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, as though I was doing something important and powerful. When I finished with the living room, I moved on to the kitchen, then the bedroom, and finally the bathroom. By the time I was done, it was well past midnight, and I was exhausted, but I felt a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though I had control over the situation. Over the next few days, things seemed to calm down. I didn't hear any more strange noises or see any more shadows out of the corners of my eye. I began to wonder if I had truly banished the ghost from my apartment. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. I froze. When I turned to look, I saw a figure standing outside, staring in at me with glowing red eyes. I knew then that I'd been foolish to think that I could banish this ghost so easily. It was still here, still watching me, still waiting for me to let my guard down, and I knew that I had to be ready in case it decided to strike again. The apartment building had always given me a strange feeling. It wasn't necessarily creepy or ominous, but there was just something about the atmosphere that made me feel uneasy. Despite this, I lived there for a few years without any significant occurrences until that fateful morning. I'd been eagerly awaiting a package from Canada Post, and it had finally arrived. I woke up early to go check if it had been delivered yet, making my way to the 3rd floor door that led to the stairwell. As I reached the round metal doorknob, I felt it turn on its own. At first, I assumed someone was on the other side of the door, about to walk through it. I waited patiently, but the door kept turning, and no one appeared. It did a complete 360. Then it stopped, as if someone had changed their mind about entering. I stood there puzzled and confused, listening for any sounds or movement, but the stairwell was silent. The only thing I could hear were my own heartbeat. I knew that no one could have entered or exited the stairwell without me seeing or hearing them, but I had no explanation for what had just happened. Finally, I gathered my courage and pushed the door open. The stairwell was empty. There was no one in sight. So I walked down the stairs, checking each door that passed, and they were all closed and locked. As I made my way to the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut. There was something not quite right about what had just happened, and I knew that I wasn't able to shake the experience off so easily. Over the next few days, strange things started to occur in my apartment. At first, they were minor occurrences like objects moving or strange noises coming from empty rooms. I tried to brush them off as coincidences or explain them away as the building settling, but deep down, I knew there was something more going on. Then one night I woke up to a cold breeze blowing through my room. I sat up shivering and realized that the window was open, even though I knew that for a fact it had closed. Before I went to bed, I closed it. As I got up, I hear a faint whisper in my ear, but when I turned around, there wasn't anyone there. From that moment on, things started to escalate. I would often wake up in the middle of the night feeling as if someone was watching me. Sometimes I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth in my living room. My friends and family noticed a change in my behavior, and they would often comment on how on edge I seemed. One night as I was getting ready for bed, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, causing me to scream and jump back. But once again, no one there. And I knew that I was the only one in the apartment. I knew then that I couldn't keep living like this. I started to research the history of the building. It turned out that the apartment building had a long and sordid history, with many deaths occurring within its walls. One particular gruesome story involved a woman who had been murdered by her husband in the third-floor apartment where I was currently living. As I read through the accounts of the building's past, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I felt as if the spirits of those who had died there were still present, trapped within the walls of the building. Over the next few weeks, I tried to find a way to rid myself of the presence that had taken over my home. I even consulted with psychics and spiritual healers. It had been a few months since the passing of the narrator's grandpa, and the family was still reeling from the unexpected loss. The house felt emptier, quieter, and there was a sense of melancholy that hung in the air. However, something strange was happening outside the house. Every now and then there would be a scratching and tearing noises coming from underneath. The family had called in exterminators to investigate, but they found nothing. The narrator couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd about the noises. They were too persistent, too unexplained. Each time they heard them, they tried to shine a light outside the window to see what was causing them. But each time they saw nothing. It was as though the source of the noise was just out of reach, taunting them from the shadows. One evening, the scratching became louder and more insistent than ever before. It was as though whatever was causing the noise was trying to claw its way out from underneath the house. The narrator and their family were gathered in the living room, tense and anxious, when suddenly the noise stopped. They exchanged a confused look, cautiously made their way outside to investigate, and the night was still and quiet. The only sound was a distant hum of cars on the nearby highway. The family scanned the area with flashlights, but they saw nothing out of the ordinary. As they began to make their way back inside, a feeling of unease settled over them. It was as though they were being watched. Over the next few days, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Strange occurrences began happening around the house. Objects would move on their own. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night. The family tried to brush it off as their imagination, but deep down they knew that something wasn't right. One night, the narrator woke up to find their grandpa standing at the foot of their bed. He was just as they remembered him, kind eyes, warm smile, his favorite tweed jacket. The narrator sat up, heart racing, and tried to speak, but no words would come out. The grandpa beckoned them, and the narrator felt a sudden urge to follow. They got out of bed and followed their grandpa through the darkened house. The only sound was their footsteps on the creaky floorboards. They made their way outside, and the grandpa led them to the spot where the scratching had been coming from. There in the moonlight, the family saw a figure hunched over, digging frantically at the ground. They couldn't make out any features, but they could sense a malevolent energy emanating from it. The grandpa stepped forward and the figure turned to face him. In the pale moonlight, they could see that it was no longer human, but something twisted and grotesque. The family watched in horror as the grandpa engaged in a fierce battle with the creature. They could hear the clash of steel against flesh, the clash of bones breaking. The grandpa fought bravely, but in the end, the creature was too powerful. The grandpa fell to the ground, and the creature vanished into the night. The family was left shaken and traumatized by the experience. They tried to explain it away as a nightmare, a hallucination, but deep down they knew the truth. Their grandpa had come back to protect them from the malevolent spirit that had been tormenting their home. From that day on, the family felt a sense of peace settle over them. The scratching and tearing noises ceased. The house felt less haunted, and they knew that their grandpa was watching over them, protecting them from the unknown forces that lurked in the darkness. It was the year 2003, and Emily was living in a trailer out in the countryside with her boyfriend and their 2 daughters. The trailer was cozy, but it was located far from civilization, and they were the only ones living in the area. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there were no streetlights to light up the dark nights. The only sources of light came from the moon and the stars, which were often obscured by clouds. One evening, shortly after time had changed to darkness, Emily walked out in the hallway to get something from the kitchen. As she walked, she caught sight of a shadowy figure in the living room. She froze in her tracks and stared back at the figure. It was tall, dark, and seemed to be staring right back at her. Emily didn't get any bad vibes, but she felt uncomfortable, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A few months after, Emily first saw the Shadow Man. She and her family were awoken in the middle of the night by what sounded like a full-grown person sprinting back and forth across the room. The sound was loud and clear, and it was coming from above them. Emily and her boyfriend were paralyzed by fear in their bed, unsure of what to do. The sprinting continued for what seemed like an eternity, but when it finally stopped, there was nothing but silence. Emily's boyfriend checked the snow and the footprints. There was none. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She felt like the Shadow Man and the sprinting on the roof were connected somehow. The following night, when the Shadow Man appeared in the living room again, Emily decided to take action. She put out her energy and let the Shadow Man know that she wouldn't tolerate any more strange behavior. She told him to leave her family alone. She outlined the outside of her trailer with salt. For a year, Emily and her family continued to live in the trailer. She still felt the Shadow Man's presence, but there were no further instances of strange behavior. They eventually built a house and sold the trailer to a girl that Emily had gone to school with. 6 months after the girl moved into the trailer, it burned down. The girl claimed that she left a candle burning, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the Shadow Man had something to do with it. A few months later, the girl passed away, and the cause of her death was unknown. Despite no longer living in the trailer, Emily still felt an uneasy feeling most days. She felt like she was never alone. Even when she was home alone, she knew that the Shadow Man was still with her, watching and waiting. Years went by, and Emily moved on with her life. She got married and had more children. But she never forgot about the Shadow Man. Whenever she would pass by the trailer, she would get a chill. She would remember the strange occurrences that happened there. One day, she received a call from a friend who was driving past the old trailer. The trailer was no longer standing, and in its place was a large, beautiful tree. Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her, as if the Shadow Man had finally moved on. She knew that the tree represented new life, and she felt like the Shadow Man's spirit had finally been put to rest. To this day, Emily still thinks about the Shadow Man and the strange occurrence that happened in the trailer. She'll never forget the feeling of being watched, but she knows that the Shadow Man meant no harm. She's grateful for the experience because it taught her to be more aware of her surroundings and to always trust her intuition. It was a quiet night in the European-style house, and the only sound that could be heard was the soft hum of the air conditioning. The family that lived in the house had gone to bed, and the streets outside were deserted. All was peaceful until a sound interrupted the silence. It was a soft creaking, like someone walking on an old wooden board. But it wasn't coming from the family's apartment. It was coming from the apartment above. The family tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just an elderly woman who lived there shuffling around her apartment. But as the nights passed, the sounds became louder and more frequent. It wasn't just creaking anymore, it was the sound of footsteps running up and down the length of the apartment. It was loud enough to wake the family up from their sleep, and they began to worry. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and 2 sons. They were a close-knit family, and they tried to comfort each other as the strange sounds continued. They talked about it, and they tried to come up with a logical explanation. They couldn't find one. So one day the mother decided to talk to the elderly woman who lived above them. She went to her apartment and knocked on the door. But there was no answer. She tried again the next day and still no response. The family began to worry that something had happened to the elderly woman, and they called the police. When the police arrived, they found the elderly woman had passed away in her sleep. She had no family, and it was up to the landlord to clean out her apartment. The family was relieved that the noises would finally stop, but they didn't. If anything, they became louder and more frequent. The family tried to rationalize it, but they couldn't. They began to believe that the elderly woman was haunting them from beyond the grave. The family began to see strange things around the apartment. Objects would move on their own. Doors would open and close, and the temperature in the apartment would drop dramatically. The father tried to dismiss it, and it was all imagination, but deep down he knew something more. So one night the father decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way up to the attic. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The father looked around trying to find the source of the noises, but he found nothing. He turned to leave, but as he did, he felt a cold breeze brush right past him. He shivered despite the heat of the attic and hurried back down toward his family. The family tried to ignore the haunting, but it was impossible. The sounds grew louder and more frequent, and they began to fear for their own safety. They contacted a paranormal investigator, and he agreed to come and investigate the apartment. The investigator arrived and set up his equipment. He walked around the apartment asking questions and trying to make contact with the ghost. Suddenly, his equipment began to beep wildly. The investigator was excited. I think he had made contact with the ghost. The family watched in awe as the investigator spoke to the ghost, asking it questions and trying to determine why it was haunting the apartment. The ghost was reluctant to answer, but eventually it spoke. It was the elderly woman that lived in the apartment above them. She had been alone in life, and in death, she didn't want to be alone. The investigator tried to persuade the ghost to move on, but it was reluctant. It had grown attached to the family and didn't want to leave them. The investigator tried a different approach. He convinced the ghost to move on into the afterlife with the promise that the family would always remember and honor its presence. Reluctantly, the ghost agreed, and the investigator performed a ritual to help it cross over. After that night, the family no longer heard any strange noises or felt any unusual presences in the house. They knew that the ghost had finally found peace and had moved on into the afterlife. However, the investigator couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on in the house. So he continued to investigate and discovered that the ghost had been protecting the family from a malevolent spirit that had been lurking in the house. The malevolent spirit had been trying to harm the family for years, but the ghost had been keeping it at bay. Without the ghost's protection, the family would have been in grave danger. The investigator realized that the ghost had sacrificed its own chance to move on to the afterlife to protect the family. He was filled with a deep sense of gratitude and admiration for the ghost's bravery and selflessness. He made a vow to always remember the ghost's sacrifice and to help other spirits find peace and closure, and he knew that he would always carry the memory of the ghost's presence with him as a reminder of the power of love and strength in the human spirit. The house was an old 3-story Victorian style, with creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and a musty smell that seemed to linger in every room. From the moment she stepped inside with her son, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She chalked it up to the age of the house, but the fact that it had been empty for so long before moving in might have been a factor too. At first, everything seemed normal. Her son, like any child, was excited to explore the new space and make it his own. But then he started complaining about a shadow man. At first, she thought it was just an overactive imagination, but as the days wore on, her son's fear grew, and so did hers. The woman started to do her own research, poring over books about ghosts and hauntings. She talked to friends who claimed to have experience with the paranormal. She even went so far as to consult with a local psychic, but no one could explain what was happening in her home. The shadow man continued to torment her son. He was always there, lurking in the darkness, whispering in his ear, trying to lead him somewhere. She tried to comfort him and make him feel safe, but the fear in his eyes was too much to bear. One night, she decided to confront the shadow man. Along with nothing but a flashlight and her courage, she tiptoed into her son's room. There in the corner was the shadow man. It was darker than darkness itself, a black mass that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want?" The shadow man didn't answer, just hovered there, watching her with its empty eyes. The woman tried to reason with it, to plead with it, to leave her son alone, but it didn't seem to care. It was content to stay, to whisper, to scare her son, to torment them both. Desperate, she reached out to a paranormal investigator. The investigator arrived with all the gadgets and gizmos of his trade, ready to uncover the truth. He took readings, set up cameras, and interviewed the woman and her son. As it turned out, the house had a long and sordid history. It had been on a site of a murder-suicide back in the 1920s. A man had killed his wife and children and then turned the gun on himself. The shadow man, it seemed, was the ghost of that man. The investigator tried to persuade the ghost to move on, but it was reluctant. It had grown attached to the family and didn't want to leave them. The investigator tried a different approach. He convinced the ghost to move on into the afterlife, promising that he and his family there would be reunited with them for all eternity. To the woman's surprise, the shadow man vanished the next day. Her son slept soundly for the first time in months, and the house felt lighter somehow, as if weight had been lifted from it. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. She would hear whispers in the night and footsteps in the hallway, and see shadows moving just out of the corner of her eye. She knew that the ghost was still there, watching over them, keeping them safe, and she was okay with that. She had to accept that ghosts were a part of her life now, and that sometimes they were there to help, not just to haunt. This 26-year-old female had always been close to her grandmother, so when her grandmother's dementia began to worsen, she decided to move in with her and become her full-time caregiver. The old house where her grandmother had lived since the 60s was a beautiful old home, full of history and character. It was a 2-story house, but her grandmother's condition meant that she couldn't make it upstairs. So she slept in the upstairs bedroom. The first few nights, the old house were quite uneventful, but on the third night, I was startled awake with the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The creaky wooden floors amplified the sound, making it impossible to ignore. She got out of bed and went to investigate, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to bed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the next night it happened again. This time the footsteps were accompanied by the sound of running. She bolted out of bed and raced to the hallway, but once again there was no one there. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a sense of unease creeping up on her. Something was not right in that old house. As time passed, the strange occurrences continued. Things would go missing only to turn up places that she had already checked. She heard knocking on the upstairs windows even though there was no one outside. And then there was the time that she was coming into the room and she found the sink running, even though she knew she turned it off earlier. She tried to ignore these events, chalking them up to coincidences or her imagination. But then one night something happened that she couldn't ignore. She woke up to the feeling of someone playing with her feet. It was a strange sensation, as if someone was gently moving up and down the sole of her foot. She could feel it, and it didn't stop until she quickly moved her foot. She was scared, but at the same time, she felt a sense of curiosity what was happening in this old house. She decided to start investigating. She spent hours online, reading about ghosts and hauntings. She talked to people who had experienced similar things, and finally she decided to try and communicate with the entity that seemed to be haunting the old house. She set up a camera in her room, hoping to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. She also started to keep a journal, documenting every strange occurrence that happened in the house. And then one night she decided to try and communicate with whatever was there. She sat in her room with the lights off and began to speak out loud. "If there is anyone here, please give me a sign," she said. She waited, but there was no response. She tried again. "I don't want to harm you. I just want to understand. Can you please give me a sign?" Suddenly she felt a chill run down her spine. She could sense that something was there watching her. She waited, holding her breath, and then she heard a faint whisper. It was a voice she couldn't quite make out, but it was there. She turned on the lights and looked around, but no one. As the weeks went by, she continued to document the strange occurrences in the house. She also tried to communicate with the entity, hoping to gain a better understanding of what was happening, and then one night she finally got her answer. She was in her room lying in bed when she heard a soft voice. It was her grandmother calling out her name. She got out of bed and went to her grandmother's room, but she was fast asleep. Confused, she went back to her room, only to hear her grandmother's voice again. This time she realized that it wasn't her grandmother's voice she was hearing. It was the voice of the entity that had been haunting the house. She sat down on her bed and started talking to the entity. "Who are you?" she asked. The voice responded. "I am the previous owner of this house. I died here and I never left." She was shocked. She never considered the possibility that the entity haunting the house could be a former owner. She started asking more questions, and the voice continued to answer. They talked for hours until finally she had a better understanding of what was happening in the old home. After their conversation, she felt a sense of relief. She knew that the entity meant no harm, and she was simply stuck in the house, unable to move. She continued to document the strange occurrence, but she no longer felt scared or uneasy. She had finally made peace with the entity and was able to live in the old house without fear. Years later, when she moved out of the old house, she left behind her journal and the camera she had set up to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. The new owners of the house never reported any strange occurrences, but she knew that the entity was still there, watching over the house that had been its home for so many years. Terrifying things that have happened fairly recently. Most of these stories begin sometime after I go to bed. Most take place in my bed, which I share with my 2 dogs and my wife. I'm a man in my mid-30s. I guess the best place to begin would be the first time I believe I astral projected. I was visiting a friend and enjoying a rare night without my wife and dogs. As I achieved perfect relaxation, I realized that I could push out and leave my body. I floated in the blackness and eventually came across 2 people sitting at a table outside. Although I could not understand their words, I could hear them talking. They were talking about sports, but I couldn't make out any specifics. I tried to talk to them and I told them my name, but I don't think they could hear me. However, I believe that I may have then attracted the attention of a malevolent being of some kind. I could feel his evil once he became aware of me. I quickly returned to my body and woke up. It was barely midnight locally. Later that evening, I tried the same thing, and the evil thing was waiting for me. I couldn't sleep anymore that night. I've tried twice more to astral project since that event, but this thing found me almost immediately. I no longer attempt this, save one other time, which we will discuss later. This next story is a bit more recent. It's preceded by a previous event with an epilogue, but I don't write any notes about that one. I was sleeping and having a very realistic dream. I was aware that it was a dream and that it was important for me to be there. I was in a small comic book convention looking for Charlie Chan novels, which I have never read or attempted to read in the real world. Perhaps I should, all things considered. I was walking with a watcher who also seemed to know that I was dreaming. He told me that it was important to remember the following things once I woke up: the storm, this man, the wife, the sound, the watcher, the dream, the fear, and the defender. He told me I needed to find the answer to the question, how can Dodge just give up on the world? There is something I don't quite remember about killing one's own brother for power. I think that was related to Dodge, whoever that is. Epilogue. I woke up. It was last winter and very dark in the bedroom. Suddenly there is a red light being projected like a laser on the ceiling. It is of a spinning wheel with an animal head in the center. There are multiple boxes on the outside of the wheel. These boxes each have a symbol in them that I do not recognize. I'm scared to close my eyes. The wheel is still there, in my vision, even with my eyes closed. I sit up and it's still there, spinning slowly in front of me. It changes perspective a little, but not entirely. I decide to go up. Despite this, it stays with me until I turn the light on in the bathroom. This epilogue happens 3 more times, all basically the same. I woke up my wife once, but she didn't see anything unusual. Neither wheel went away until after I turned on the light or walked around a bit. The next event is not particularly scary, but was rather jarring. I was in bed with the lights on. My wife was reading, but I had put down my book. I had a song stuck in my head, just a random rock song I knew pretty well. Suddenly, there was this brief buzzing sound, and the song in my head was replaced by a rap song of some sort. I'm not familiar with the genre, but I didn't recognize it at all. I could not and cannot remember the song anymore. This was less than a year ago. There was a similar event in which I felt a wave of some sort push through me, with a loud buzz, and well, it felt like I had just witnessed reality rewrite itself. If you have seen the movie Yesterday, it was kind of like that. Like something huge happened, but no one noticed. The story I'll share with you is similar to the epilogue mentioned earlier. However, this one's a bit different. Rather than the wheel, there is a human-looking arm projected in a rectangle. The arm was Caucasian and couldn't see past the upper arm. It was moving slightly, but not much. The rectangle faded away into the static, like you used to see one of those old televisions if you left them on too long. Once it was gone, the red lights returned, but this time in the shape of skulls floating across the ceiling. They faded away themselves without my need to turn on a light. I have several other stories about seeing hideous creatures. One time I think I mentally traveled into the past onto a battlefield, and one terrifying attempt at the thing trying to grab my arm from under a bed. I'm fairly certain that there's a lot more that I can't remember. I know all this sounds. I had to share it, but I'm scared about what my family and friends might think. Every word above is true. Be safe.